Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for tuning in to this Enabling Change and Innovation webinar. Today's webinar is slightly different from usual, as I'll not only be hosting it, but today I have the extra pleasure of presenting the content too. So buckle up your seatbelts and get ready to explore the topic, using webinars to enable change without anyone needing to travel. So you think you'd like to use webinars as a way of enabling change? Well, that's a great idea. And in today's presentation, I'll cover using webinars to enable change. So I'll share some of my experiences. Then we'll talk about planning your first webinar. So it's all about you. Here's some advice for what you might do. And then finally, I'll talk about some tips and tricks. As I mentioned before, I'll pause for questions at the end of each of those sections. So just type in the question panel as we go along. So let me set the scene for you about why webinars are important to me. For you see, I work with the beef industry. And as you may know, Australia is one of the world's most efficient beef producers and also the largest exporter of beef. In fact, 2/3 of all our beef production is exported to over 100 countries around the world. The value of these exports are around $4.7 billion. And based on the tons of meat exported, this makes us the #1 exporter in the world. Now, there are almost 29 million head of cattle in Australia. And to put that in perspective, the current population of Australia is only 23 million. So there you go. We have more beef cattle than people. Now, I have a little picture of Skippy down the bottom here to remind me to find out who knows about Australia. So here's a question for you. How many kangaroos do you think there are in Australia? So if you can select, if you think there's fewer than the number of people, the same, or more. So what do you think the answer is here? Okay, and I'll close that off in 3, 2, 1, because I can see that everyone's really got the idea of the polls now. So I do see a few more sneaking in, so I'll just wait a moment here. Okay, there we go. And I'll share those results with you. Okay, so everyone thinks that there are more than the number of people, and indeed that's true. So in actual fact, while we've got 23 million people, there are 25 million kangaroos, but still there are 29 million cattle. So there's still more cattle than there are kangaroos. Okay, so let's now focus on the people involved in the beef industry. We know that there's almost 80,000 beef properties in Australia, and around 200,000 people are involved in the red meat industry, including on-farm production, the processing, and the retailing. Now, this slide shows you the relative size of production for each of the states and territories. So you'll see that Queensland leads the pack, followed by New South Wales and Victoria. However, that doesn't really give us an accurate picture of where the properties are really located. Whereas this picture demonstrates the geographic challenge we have when we want to engage with those 80,000 beef producers. Now, admittedly, the Future Beef program that I work with only covers the northern half of Australia, but folks, that's still rather challenging. Now, I'm going to start talking about extension, or agricultural extension to be technically correct. A contemporary definition of extension is the process of enabling change in individuals, communities and industries involved with primary industries and natural resource management. My area of work is around e-extension, which I define as the use of electronic technologies to enhance traditional approaches such as paper-based and face-to-face, so as to enable change in individuals, communities and industries. Now, let me be clear that I believe firmly that face-to-face is always best for building rapport and trust with people. However, in our situation, it's too expensive to continue that conversation face-to-face. So that's why I get excited by e-extension. And I'd suggest that E really stands for electrifying, or at least exciting. So let me tell you about how we aim to use eExtension with our future beef activities. You see, we want to make our workshops that we run with the beef industry even more effective. We'd like even more people adopting the changes that we talk about during the workshops, and we'd like both our presenters and participants to travel less and spend their time more productively than waiting in airport lounges or driving for 10 hours. And that way you don't lose your luggage, you don't get delayed, you don't end up somewhere else because the place you're trying to get to is covered in fog. So, of course, we still run our face-to-face workshops, as we know that's the best way to communicate our often complex messages. Plus, it allows the participants to get to know each other and build trust in the presenters. However, we aim to complement the workshops by using some of these eExtension tools, such as webinars, where appropriate. For example, we can use a webinar beforehand to warm people up to the workshop topic and find out how much they already know about the topic that will be discussed at the workshop. We can then use a webinar during the workshop to beam in a keynote speaker from interstate or even overseas. And more importantly, we aim to use them afterwards to further engage our workshop participants. We aim to take them on a learning journey that might last 12 or 18 months after the initial workshop. That way we can walk alongside them as they consider adopting the innovations in their different situations. And you know, if we're really clever, we can invite some of the producers from the workshop who we know have already started adopting some of the innovations and get them to share at the webinar what they did and how it's improved their business. Then the other people can be thinking, well, if Bill did that, then maybe I can too. Because we all know that farmers, like most of us, like to learn from one another's experiences. They like to lean over the fence and see what their neighbour has done. You know, it's no different for us, of course. We'd much prefer that our neighbour buy the expensive hybrid vehicle so we can take it for a test drive or kick the tyres. Of course, the reduced travel does save money, but that's not our primary aim. It's about getting better engagement, which in turn increases the likelihood of greater adoption of the desired practice changes. However, for the bean counters amongst us today, here is how I calculate the savings. An average 1-hour web conference with 10 participants from regional centres around Queensland can save 60 hours of travel time, which equates to about $6,000 in associated salary. So that saving of travel time is you no longer need to pack your bags, drive to the airport, wait at the airport lounge, board the plane, fly to wherever, and then the same once you've reached your destination, travelling to the venue and then returning back home. So that's where the 60 hours comes from. And then it also saves $2,500 of airfares and over 3 metric tonnes of carbon dioxide. So using these assumptions, it was estimated that the use of these technologies saved our department over $1 million and 350 tonnes of CO2 in 1 year. But as I said, I get more excited by the benefit this brings to the way we can engage with our target audience. So let's have a look at some of those in detail. So these are some of the benefits that come from using webinars. So back in 2011, we surveyed just over 100 of our DAF staff who were using webinars. And we found that over 80% of the respondents indicated that they could better engage with their clients as a result of using web conferencing. A similar number, 78%, indicated that webinars enabled them to be more innovative with their work. And finally, almost 75% reported that they could be more responsive to their clients' needs as a result of using webinars. The combination of these 3 factors can power adoption rates and decrease the adoption lag times. So just before I pause to take some questions, I'll emphasise that in my mind, webinars and face-to-face events are like pepper and salt. They go well together. Of course you can just use one or other, but together they're even more powerful. So today's webinar is one of those times where one approach may just have to suffice because you're joining, at a distance. However, I suspect that I've actually met a fair proportion of today's audience face-to-face, and with others I may well have exchanged a few emails or phone calls. And yet with others, you've probably been frequent participants at some of the webinars that I've run. So again, I'm just curious to find out whether that's true or not. And so it's just dead easy for me to just launch a quick poll here and to ask, have we interacted before? So you can select as many as apply in this situation. So face-to-face, email, telephone, webinars, or no, this is our first interaction. So folks, if you can just quickly indicate there. Excellent. And see, that gives me a chance to have a nice sip of water here too. So I'll just close off that poll now because I can see most people have voted, and I'll share the results. And there we go. So interestingly, about 2/3 of the people here have interacted with me through other webinars. Others have interacted through email, telephone, and yeah, it's still quite a large number. So just under 1/3 have met me face-to-face. And it's nice that, yeah, about 1/3 of the people, yeah, this is our first interaction. So there we go. So at this stage, I will now pause for questions and comments, and I will hide that last poll. So there we go. So let me have a quick look and see what questions have come through so far. So there's a question here, do we always segregate genders in your beef workshops? Well, no. So I'm curious as to why you may have asked that question, but generally not. Now, there's a question here about how do you deal with the issues of technology? So poor internet connections and resistance to using the technology. Well, that's a really good question. My experience, though, is that with the technology, a dial-up modem is all you need to connect into a webinar. So I know people out in the bush who don't have, access to the NBN and things like that. But the webinar companies are so clever with how they compress the data traveling through the cables that you just need a dial-up modem. So it's great. And resistance to using the technology, it's really interesting. So my experience in the beef area is that the producers love them because it means that they no longer need to travel to hear the latest research and information. And it's just meaning that they can access the latest information by just, turning on their computer and listening through the phone. However, it's interesting, yeah, it seems to be that it's more the staff who are probably resistant, but yeah, that's another story because they haven't quite adopted it as much as I thought of. I'll cover more about the technology and that sort of thing later. And I can see that today, so someone's asking how many people have joined today. So at this stage, there's about 100 people here of the 205 who registered. And that's what I find is about average. The rule of thumb is that about half the number who register actually turn up live, because the other half know that, well, they can always get the recording later and watch it at their leisure. But of course, they do miss out on being able to ask questions. Interestingly enough, the industry average is only about 30%. So only 30% of those who register actually turn up live, and it's for that reason about convenience. And yes, I will talk a lot more about some of the technology things. And I'm getting some comments from some of the participants today saying, yeah, they find that farmers handle the technology well, as they are just, yes, because they're scared enough to read the instructions, yes, unlike a number of other people. And there's a question here about the maximum time a webinar should run. Yeah, look, it can be as short as 10 minutes or as long as a piece of string. So I like to keep mine to 1 hour because that's what I find works well with people's attention spans. I have run one actually recently that went for 1.5 hours, and that seemed to go well. But I really would be reluctant to do longer than that because it's just so hard to get people, to sit still for that long. But it's horses for courses and what's going to work in your situation. People are asking, do I always record my webinars? Well, no. It's the webinars that I think will be useful for people to watch afterwards. And then I'd load them up on YouTube. And And have I had any success with the sound quality? Yes, the sound quality is usually good, but I'll talk a bit about the audio in a moment. And someone's asking also, can I see how many people have watched those videos? And yes, because I put them on YouTube, the analytics tell me there how many people have viewed them. So for our beef ones, I know that over time, like several hundreds of people have watched some of those recordings. Okay, folks, I will now move on to the next section, but you feel free to keep popping in your questions there and I'll try to cover them. So, planning your first webinar. The motto I remember from Project Management 101 was that if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So do not underestimate the time it takes to plan and deliver a good webinar. You know, it really frustrates me when people think that a virtual event takes virtually no time to prepare. In actual fact, an event like today's would take me about 2 days to get ready for. My experience is that you need to do about the same amount of organisation as you would for a face-to-face event, plus more because of the online environment. And I'll run you through some of that shortly. Now, some people have already been asking about webinar providers. But choosing the webinar platform is really the least of your worries. There are a number of really good commercial products out there, and there's a number of free ones as well, though they often have strings attached. So I've used I've used Cisco WebEx, Citrix GoToWebinar, and Google Hangouts, and they've all worked fine for me. If you work in the government or a large organisation, I'd suggest that you start out by chatting with a friendly person from your IT department, because firewalls are often a problem. Just explain what you're wanting to achieve and find out what products they know that will work smoothly on their system. So years ago, when I first introduced web conferencing into our department, it was easy to go with Cisco WebEx, as the IT people already perceive Cisco as a quality supplier due to the routers and other hardware that they produce. It was a more expensive option than other products, but sometimes it's better to use the foot in the door technique. So that's what I did, and after a couple of years we swapped over to Citrix GoToWebinar, as it did much the same at a slightly cheaper price for what we were wanting. Your situation's bound to be different though, so you need to do your research, but just keep your IT people on side. Without their assistance, you aren't going to get far. Then you need a bit of computer hardware to make your life easier. And here's a shot of my desk showing the 2 screens that I use. So it makes it so much easier. So my general manager runs a staff update webinar every 6 weeks with his 150 or so staff across the state. And I've helped him a lot initially, but over time he's taken off the training wheels and he does most of it on his own. But while he was doing his presentation last week, I stepped back and took a photo of my desk, thinking it might be of interest to you. So you can see here that I've got 2 screens. So I have the PowerPoint presentation on the left screen, and this is just how it is today. And then I've got a floating control panel over here that really is the dashboard for my webinar. Now, your one is slightly smaller and has fewer features, but when you're hosting it, you get extra panels. And so, for instance, here is a little dashboard that tells me how attentive folk are. And so I can tell that once there's too much red in one of these, then I need to change what I'm doing, move to the next slide, or become more animated with what I'm saying. On the other side here, I've got the list of attendees. Then I've got the question and answer panel open here, and also the chat box over here. So that just enables me to better see what's happening, whereas I'm always surprised when people use a single screen, because to me it's just a little bit too small for what we're wanting to do. Okay, now with webinars, I recommend that you need to practice. So you need to find a small group of people perhaps and start practicing. So once you've selected the platform you're going to use, you need to become familiar with the technology. So get a few of your colleagues or friends to join you for some sessions where you can practice changing the slides, running polls, using the chat function or whatever else that you're likely to do in a real situation. Now, here's a timeline of the things that I do before any large webinar. So I'm going to talk through the things I do 4 weeks beforehand, because to me that's a good lead time for an event like this. Then 30 minutes before the start time, I'll talk about what to do at the start, at the end, straight afterwards, and a little bit of troubleshooting. So this will probably start to answer some of the questions that have been coming through. So a month before, that's where I choose the topic, and I always go for a what's in it for me approach. And so as I describe the topic, I do so in the terms of the likely target audience who will be listening in. I then choose the time and day. Now, so I'm going to share my preferences here, and it's up to you to do what works best for your target audience. But for me and the ones that I run, I find that generally a Tuesday, Wednesday or Thursday are better days of the week, that often people are just busy on Mondays and Fridays. And for the time of day, I like to go somewhere in the middle, so between 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. But again, it depends on the type of webinar you're running. So recently I did one where I had a guy from Canada, and so I brought it forward a couple of hours, so it was more like at 9:30 or 10:30 in the morning for us, because then that was about 10:30 at night for him, and I wanted to get the webinar finished so that he could get to bed before midnight. For the time of day, also I consider which time slot to go for. So I used to start the webinars on the hour, so at say 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock, but these days I now go for the half hour, so at 12:30 or 1:30, because what I find is that a lot of the people coming to the webinars that I run work in an office environment where typically you attend meetings that go from, say, 11 o'clock till 12 o'clock. So if that meeting's running late, it then means that they're running late for my webinar. And so I noticed that a lot of people were joining in like 5 or 10 minutes late. So I put 2 and 2 together and thought, aha, let's run them at 12:30, because not many other meetings will be finishing at that time. And yeah, so far, so good. The invitation, yeah, of course, have an enticing subject line, and then you need to promote that using multiple channels. So for today's, I've used LinkedIn, I've used Twitter, and I use MailChimp, so email is my main way of doing that. Now, you also need to do a test run with the presenters, because in my experience, I've actually, of all the webinars that I've run and all the presenters that I've worked with, only 1, maybe 2 have actually presented at a webinar before. So I always like to run through with them at least a week before to show them how easy the system is for them to use and how they can make best use of it, and just so that they're comfortable with it. So for those, I show them how easy it is to join. I emphasize to them that they need to use a telephone as opposed to VoIP or a mobile phone. So a landline is always best, and they actually need to pick up the phone and put it next to their mouth, unless they have an overhead headset like I'm using today, and I'll show you a picture of that later on. Also show them how to share documents, how to use the presentation tools, a pointer or a pen, although usually I suggest they just use the mouse cursor, because that's easy to use, particularly the first time. And I need to emphasize to them that the webinar will lack the feedback of a live audience. So it's more like a radio interview where you need to speak confidently, imagining that everyone's sitting on the edge of their seats waiting for your presentation. So now we've arrived at the day of the webinar, and 30 minutes, although these days I'm tending to do it 60 minutes before start time. So I close all the unnecessary programs, especially email, because the last thing you want are those little pop-up messages that Outlook and Lotus like to do on your screen. So then you start the webinar and you join the audio conference early. You need to load up the presentations. So you have your PowerPoints, and if you've got an agenda that you're going to share in Word or something like that, you get them all open on your computer so that they're available. This is when I do the final practice with presenters and show them how, again, to load their presentation and to move from slide to slide. And what I'm doing these days is I like to interact with the early birds. So I'll while I will have joined in an hour before, I'll start the webinar at about 10 minutes before it's due to start, because in the invitations I send out, I always encourage people to join early, because sometimes they need to download a little bit of software on their computer, and even if they've been to webinars before, that the tricky software developers keep improving the product so that you can join and it still might take 1 or 2 minutes because there's an update to the software. And I like to interact with the early birds because for me that's a way of building rapport with the audience, and it's a bit of self-disclosure on my behalf. You know, I share photos from my yard and other things around, and yeah, people get to know me a little bit like that. So then the webinar begins. So I always like to start on time, or within a minute anyway, because there's difference. Like in my office I have 3 clocks, so there's one on my desk phone, there's one on my computer, and then there's the iPhone. And invariably the desk phone is like 10 minutes late. The computer is pretty close, it might be within 2 or 3 minutes, but for me the iPhone just is that's the oracle for me. So you start on time, you welcome participants, you give I always like to give a brief overview of the screen, including the participant panel, you know, what it looks like, and I like to describe how to interact online. So I don't only say it, but I get people to do it, as you experienced earlier in today's webinar. So you raise your hand, use of the chat box and the Q&A box. I also talk about how to use the phone and the VoIP and the floating toolbar and how it likes to hide itself. Now, a really important thing to consider is, just like when you go scuba diving, to have a buddy. So the buddy system works really well for webinars. So I'm fortunate I've got a buddy with my colleague Greg, who's in the office next door to me, and he rescued me just yesterday. So I was doing a small webinar. It was a team meeting, and I had muted myself, and I started talking, thinking that the other people could hear me. Greg picked it up and was able to indicate to me that I was muted, so I was quickly able to fix that. So that's just one example of how Buddy helps, but particularly when you're starting out, it's great to have someone who's joining the webinar with you. So it doesn't have to be a colleague, it can be actually one of the participants, and you just tee up with them beforehand to say, hey, I notice you're coming along to, you know, next week's webinar. Would you mind just being my buddy? And if there's something appearing on the screen that I think I'm talking to, but, you know, it's not there, can you just, you know, politely interrupt and say, oh, John, that graph you're talking about, you know, we can't actually see it at the moment. Or if you're talking too softly, they might just politely interrupt and say, oh, John, you know, you're a bit soft, can you speak up a bit? So they verbalize what everyone else is thinking, but because you've approached them beforehand, it kind of gives them the permission to do so. So that works really well. At the end of the webinar, I always like to have some discussion starter questions ready. So the Dorothy Dix types of questions. And then I thank the presenters, participants, you know, funders, sponsors, whoever. I encourage the participants to complete the online survey. Where it's appropriate, promoting other upcoming webinars or events that you know that your target audience might be interested in. And then thank everyone for attending, and close the session cleanly. And by that I mean, don't allow the dribble of comments to come in, and sometimes when you've got presenters, they start chatting, saying, oh, you know, that wasn't as bad as we thought. So that's where I just close the webinar. And again, I start on time, I finish on time, even if it means that I miss out on some of those promotional items that I discussed there. Then afterwards, I like to debrief with the presenters, especially if it was their first webinar. So I'll just phone them up and chat with them about how it was and any learning for them. And it's just a way of thanking them as well. So during that discussion, we'll discuss the process and the content and, yeah, suggest ideas for next time. And I usually reinforce to them that the first webinar they do will always be the most difficult, and if they can do it again within the next, you know, 4 or 5 weeks, then the easier it's going to be for them. They also send out follow-up emails to the participants that include links and useful things that they might find handy. I also like to summarise the survey results, including some participant quotes, and that's what I send to the funders and the presenters so that they can use that in some of their reports as well. And folks, I recommend celebrate surviving your first webinar hosting experience. So it is a big deal. So, go and have some coffee with friends or do something else that's appropriate in your situation. Now, a little bit of troubleshooting. If you experience problems during a webinar, don't hesitate to phone the friendly support staff of your webinar platform. And I suggest you add that number to your mobile phone contacts so you can call them quickly. So on my iPhone, I've got the Citrix guys, and I've put in the commas for pauses and the correct numbers so that it just gets straight through to the help people. And they can join your session and talk you through any problems. And also just keep your audience informed. So, if things are going wrong, just share with them that, oops, it seems as though the presenter's phone line is dead. Just wait a moment while I phone them on a different line and see if we can get them back. Or if there's a fire alarm happening in your building, just say, sorry about that, folks. We've got an unexpected fire drill test thing happening at the moment. We'll just wait quietly for that to finish. So why don't you quickly go and grab a coffee and we'll be back in a minute or two and surely it'll be finished. Okay, so I've now run through planning for your first webinar. So I'll pause at this stage and look at the myriad of questions that have come through. Okay, and see, when I'm hosting other people's webinars, I've had a chance to look at these questions and to group them and that sort of thing. So it's a little bit hard when you do everything, but hey, that's life. Question here, do you have to toggle at your end between PowerPoint and survey slides? Yes, I do. So it just takes me a moment to go to my floating control panel to launch the next poll. And again, if I weren't presenting, I would actually have the next poll ready to go at the click of a button, but it just takes like 2 or 3 clicks, so that's why sometimes there's a little bit of a pause there. Now, do I provide an online chat room on topics for participants if they wish to discuss a topic after the webinar? Well, what I do is I have a blog, and I'll talk about that towards the end of this webinar, so that's how I cover that. Now, the role of the host is the one who has the webinar license, and so that enables you to host webinars, and then you have presenters who you can invite along who can then present their material, and then participants or attendees are the third category of people. So these are good questions, folks. So the audio does drop in and out sometimes, and particularly if you're using VoIP, and so that's where it's better for people to use a landline. Unfortunately, it's just the way the technology is at the moment. There's a question here about whether you can pre-record a webinar and then run it later without having to present it live. Well, you can. It's a little bit tricky, but there certainly are webinar platforms that do that better than others. Personally, I like the live experience and to do a recording of that. The cost of the system, so the license I have with GoToWebinar, it's about $100 a month for up to about 100 people, and then I pay another $100 so as to have access to a toll-free number that I use with the beef industry. I don't use it with today's audience, sorry, because it's just too expensive, and I'm thinking hopefully you get enough out of these enabling change webinars to not mind phoning the 03 number or using the computer audio. Question here, can there be multiple presenters talking from different locations? Absolutely. So I ran a webinar just recently where there was one guy in Brisbane, one in Western Australia, and one in Northern Queensland, and one from, I think it was Sydney. So yes, they can be anywhere, and it's seamless, that as you pass the baton to them, they can then be presenting. I do sometimes run webinars at nights, and I also do them in the morning. So I've run them at 7 in the morning, and I've run them at 7 at night. So again, it just depends on your target audience. I actually did a little test once that for the same target audience, I offered one at lunchtime and one at, I think it was 7 or 8 o'clock at night, because the my colleagues were saying, oh, we need to do it at night. So we did it, but actually very few people came along, embarrassingly so, in fact. But it was a good idea, so we tested it. And that's what you need to do, folks, is just test different things. Okay, it's a good comment here. Our staff are too shy and scared of using new technology such as webinars. How do you convince people that it's a fantastic way to communicate with vast distances involved? Yeah, good question. For me, I like to demonstrate to them how effective it is and then keep letting them know how good it was. So, just recently I ran a webinar for the beef industry and we had just over 600 people register for that. So don't tell me that the beef industry isn't ready for this technology. And I know that for some people it's difficult to engage, as a presenter like this, but, you need to adopt new technology. Otherwise, you'll be called a laggard. Now, folks, I'm going to move on to the next section because I can see a lot of the questions are talking about some of the quick tips and tricks that I'm going to talk about. So the first one here is, my suggestion is you need to engage with your audience, and the sooner you can do it, the better it's going to be. So, as I said earlier, that's why I like to start interacting even before the actual performance. So that's why I'll start 10 minutes earlier and I'll chat with the audience and get them using some of the system, like raising their hands or typing in where they're located. So that's my first suggestion. My next one is, look, checklists. Checklists are wonderful. I use an online system, so it's the Teamwork, and you can see the web address here. So I use teamworkpm.net, and I have a standard template of, I think it's 22 things that I need to do to successfully deliver a webinar. And the clever little online system sends me an email each day saying, hey John, this is what you need to do today. And I love it because that way I know I actually get through all the things that I need to do, so that way I don't have to lie awake in bed at night thinking, oh, did I need to do the polls, or, what it was. I know everyone's going to ask me if I can send you my template, but I think it's actually better that you work out what's going to work for you in your situation. Now, another suggestion is to use a quiet office or a meeting room if you work in an open plan area. If you're delivering a webinar, you need to do that. Of course, if you're just attending, then you can listen with earphones and that sort of thing. You'll note, by the way, that I don't unmute people to ask questions. I did once upon a time, but I invariably found that people would be VoIPing in and they didn't have their computer audio set up correctly, so that as they asked the question, it went through their microphone around the world to get to me, and then the audio would come out for the audience, but a split second later it had come out of the computer speakers of the person asking, so you then got this really bad feedback loop. Sometimes I also found that people would take too long to introduce the question, whereas if you get them to type it in, they just get to the crux of the matter without feeling that they need to, set the scene and that sort of thing. Now, the host and presenters, as I said before, should talk directly into their telephone handset and not use the hands-free option. And if one of your presenters forgets that, as one of mine did last week, just politely interrupt and say, look, can you pick up your phone? And you know what? It's just so much clearer. And always keep a glass of water handy. Because as a presenter, well, I find anyway that my throat gets dry, and of course that shouldn't be chilled water, but just lukewarm, because otherwise, it's not so good for your vocal cords. Now, my next tip, so I'm going to run through these quickly to get through as many as I can. The smaller the size of your PowerPoint presentation, the quicker it will be to load up and to move the slides. So I recommend that when you've got a picture like the one I had just before about the Teamwork, if you double-click on it, so this is in PowerPoint, if you double-click on it, you'll get the Format Picture option, and it'll come up with this tab here about the picture. You click on Compress, and then you'll get this one here, and if you go All Pictures in the Document, and then go OK, then it just shrinks the whole size of the document and makes life much easier for you. Webcams. People have been asking, why don't I have a webcam showing me talking today? The reason is I don't like people staring at me, and invariably I'm looking at a different screen or I'm looking down at my keyboard, and there's no need for you to see the top of my bald head. So I will always put a photo of myself on the front slide, and I'll show you that in a moment as well. But that's why I don't use a webcam, and plus it uses more bandwidth, so it slows things down for those people on the dial-up modem. I recommend a headset for your telephone. So this is like the one that I use. So it's still using the landline, but it means I don't actually have to pick up the phone and hold it. An iPad. This is what I have sitting next to my desk at the moment. So I have registered. So I have registered with my home email address, and before the webinar, I join the webinar on my iPad with that, so that I can be viewing to one side what you're seeing on the screen. And that just helps me know that, that as I change slides, sometimes it may take a second or two, so that gives me a really good judge as to what people are seeing. Good old iPad. Now, you may have noticed that I show the attendees list. So this is an option. I've actually found that most people don't, that you can see the name of the host and the panelist, but you don't get to see who else is there. So for me, this is like going to a party where you walk into the room and all the lights are out, and you know there's lots of people in the room, but you don't know who's there, and it just gets awkward. So I always like to do that. But hey, let's test with you. Do you like seeing the names of the other participants? So can you quickly give me your response? Because maybe I've got it wrong. Okay, so I can see most people have got the hang of it there. Can you see how using polls can just really give you quick feedback? So if I now share that with all of you, and the answer is yes, 95% of the people like to see the names of the other participants. So that's good. So thank you. I'd always wondered that. So other tips. Oh, so this was using a headshot on your first on the title slide, but I always get my presenters to do that when I can, because that way it just builds a little bit of rapport that you think, oh, that's what John looks like. Okay, I also display this at the beginning of the webinar, so I actually start an hour before, because I find that with daylight saving and all those things that inevitably people get it wrong. So often half a dozen people join 1 hour before, so I just like to display this slide. So, I start the webinar an hour earlier. It costs no more, and to me, it helps people to get the time right. Okay, my next suggestion is learn from others. So there's, so if you're using Citrix GoToWebinar, they have a website that's news.citrixonline.com/webinars, and there they list free webinars that you can come along and attend. So I really encourage you to attend as many webinars done by other folk and learn from them. So that's what works best for me anyway. So let me share some of the guys that I like to listen into. So this one here is Ken Malay. He's a brilliant presenter, so I like his work. And he has a blog called Webinar Success. So that's wsuccess.com. And you can subscribe to his blog and you get emails that come out on a regular basis. He also has this great website, and this is from the homepage, and you can click on each of these thought clouds, and he's got material that will help you with that. So he's not selling one particular web platform or another. He's just there to help you do well, and of course you can throw money at him to help you do well as well. Another guy is Roger Corville. I actually really like Roger. He does a really nice job. I think he must have been a radio host in previous life, but he's just got a nice conversation format. So he's thevirtualpresenter.com, and you'll notice that a lot of these folk have different tips and things, so you can download this white paper, 102 tips for online meetings. So if you haven't run a webinar yourself, learn from them and what they say. Now the third and final one that I'll mention is Gihan. So he's an Australian guy over in Perth, does a beautiful job. So gihanpiera.com, and again, he's got a blog, but he runs weekly webinars that you can join in for free. So it's a beautiful job. Now, if you're wanting to improve your performance, I'd suggest that you also learn some other skills. So I've got this picture here to remind me that it's group facilitation, because isn't this what you do in group facilitation? It's all the feely, touchy type stuff. But I love group facilitation because this is kind of a skill that really helps you with webinars because, you know, it's an online group, but you're still facilitating it. Another skill you might like to build is your public speaking ability. So if a picture of a microphone like this puts a chill down your spine, then maybe you need to consider going along to Toastmasters or something similar to that. That's what I did a few years ago, and they helped me not to and and bad things like that. Now, folks, I'm coming towards the end of the presentation here, and I just want to let you know that, you know, your first webinar is going to be like a roller coaster ride. And that's coming from someone who doesn't like roller coaster rides, okay? So there will be twists and turns, things will happen. So just be prepared, I guess, is what I'm wanting to say to you. I still remember the first big webinar that I ran, and unfortunately, the phone lines went down like half an hour before the webinar was to start. But you just need to be flexible and think of alternatives. So in that instance, I thought, oh, no landline, help. Oh, mobile phone. So I tried my mobile phone and it worked. So I dialed in on my mobile phone and, you know, it was able to proceed. So it's being able to just deal with some of the little things that life throws you. So this is where we need to be like ducks. So you need to be calm on the surface and paddling quickly underneath. So often people will comment to me after a webinar that I've run, oh, gee, that went so smoothly, John. And then I'll say, oh, didn't you know? Didn't you know that this happened? Oh, that happened, and then this, like, oh, all these things. And they said, no, we had no idea. And that's because on the surface you need to come across, just like a duck. So, folks, I've come to the end of that presentation, so I'll come back to the questions panel and see what questions I can answer here for you. So someone's asking about polls. So if someone gives an answer like no in the last poll, is there an opportunity to ask why? Yes, there is. And if I had more time, and that's a really good idea, so here we go. If you voted no in the last poll, as in that you don't like seeing the attendees' names, can you just type the reason in the QA box? So, yeah, that's a lovely way of doing it. And a number of people are now asking, why did 5% not like that? So let me come up and I'll look at some of these other questions here. Yes, are we able to receive a copy of the PowerPoint? Yes, you are. So after the webinar, I will send you an email that's got a PDF of all my PowerPoint slides and also a link to the recording, which my buddy Greg does for me, and then we render that and put that up on YouTube. So yes, you'll certainly be getting that, and I'll include some of the relevant links as well. So someone's asking, is there a reason that that I close the webinar and I don't continue the question session afterwards? Look, it's horses for courses, and it's what works for you. For me, I don't like to drag it out, and so I prefer to close it. But you're welcome to do what suits you. So if when you finish your webinars you'd like to go through and finish every question, then it's what works for you. And I can't stress that enough, that you need to present with your own style. And so I do things my way, and I hope mostly that you like it. Are webinars data hungry? Not so much. I did actually ask the Citrix people once how much data it used. And it's horses for courses, so if there's lots of big photos or if you share a video, then it does take more. But simple slides generally don't take up a lot of data. So how do I deal with poor literacy? Well, I guess I use pictures as much as I can on my slides, so that way I don't have to have as many words. And of course I think that's the better way to go. I've probably had more slides with words than I would normally use today, because some of those points I just wanted to get through clearly. But generally I suggest people to use pictures. Now, of course, there's a limit to how much we're going to cover today, so it's just the tip of the iceberg and just enough to get you started. So I'll answer one more question. How do I record the webinars? Well, GoToWebinar has an inbuilt recording function. So that's what I use, but Greg uses, I believe, Camtasia. So that's just a backup, because I did actually have it once happen where the inbuilt recording didn't work, but Greg was able to capture that on his. Now, folks, that's all that we're able to cover for today. So thanks for coming along and interacting with us. It's been so good to see people join in from all places across Australia, plus overseas. So it's been great having you with us today, and I'll look forward to seeing your comments and ideas over on the LinkedIn group. So wishing you all the best until we meet again. Hooroo for now.